Tessa had been looking forward to the evening for weeks. She'd met Greg on a popular dating app, and their conversations had flowed effortlessly. He was charming, funny, and had a way of making her feel seen in a world that often seemed to overlook her. When he finally asked her out to dinner, she had been ecstatic. She spent hours picking out the perfect outfit, a sleek black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, and styled her hair in a way that made her feel confident. Tonight was supposed to be special. She arrived at the restaurant a little early, nerves buzzing under her skin. The place was upscale, with dim lighting and soft jazz playing in the background. The hostess, a tall woman with a polite but detached smile, led her to a table near the window. Tessa ordered a sparkling water while she waited, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. She couldn't stop smiling as she thought about Greg. He'd told her he was 6'2", worked in finance, and loved hiking. His photos showed a well-dressed man with kind eyes and a warm smile. Everything about him had seemed perfect. Until now. Tessa's phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Greg. Smiling, she picked up the phone, expecting to see a quick note saying he was on his way. Instead, her heart sank as she read the text. "Hey, I'm really sorry, but I can't make it tonight. Something's come up. Take care." Tessa blinked, rereading the message as her excitement turned to confusion. Something felt off. He hadn't mentioned being busy or needing to reschedule. It was abrupt, and the tone was distant, like he didn't care. Her thoughts raced. Should she call him? Ask what was going on? Before she could decide, another message popped up. "Actually, I need to be honest. I didn't realize you were black. I'm not comfortable dating outside my race. I hope you understand." Tessa's breath caught in her throat. Her stomach churned, and the world around her seemed to tilt. She stared at the words, feeling a wave of shock and anger crash over her. Was this some kind of joke? After weeks of talking, laughing, and building a connection, he decided to cancel because of her skin color. The jazz music faded into the background as a storm of emotions swirled inside her: hurt, rage, disbelief. Her fingers tightened around her phone as she fought the urge to cry. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Taking a deep breath, she composed herself, her mind already racing with what to do next. She decided she wouldn't let him have the last word. Tessa typed back, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Wow. I'm not sure what's worse, your ignorance or your cowardice. Thanks for showing your true colors before I wasted any more time on you." Satisfied, she hit send and put her phone down, her hands trembling slightly. The hostess walked by, noticing her distress. "Is everything okay, miss?" she asked, her voice gentle. Tessa forced a smile and nodded. "Just a change of plans," she replied. She stood up, grabbing her clutch. She couldn't stay here, not after what just happened. But as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, a new resolve washed over her. She wasn't going to let this break her. Across town, Greg sat in his sleek apartment, staring at his phone. He'd read Tessa's response, and though he didn't reply, her words stung more than he expected. He told himself he didn't care. He had his reasons, after all. Or so he thought. Greg poured himself a glass of whiskey, trying to shake off the nagging guilt. But as he sipped the drink, his thoughts kept circling back to Tessa. He remembered her laugh, the way she talked about her passions, and her infectious positivity. A part of him wondered if he'd made a mistake. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the quiet of his apartment. Greg jumped, spilling his drink as his heart leaped into his throat. He turned toward the window, his eyes wide. Outside, the street was in chaos. People were running, cars honking wildly, and in the distance, he could hear gunfire. "What the hell?" he muttered, setting his glass down and moving cautiously toward the window. He peered outside and saw two men in masks darting into a nearby alley, clutching what looked like bags of cash. Behind them, two others were running, one carrying a handgun. Greg's stomach tightened as he realized what was happening. A robbery. The gunshots he'd heard earlier must have been from their escape. His heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. He knew he should call the police, but before he could reach for his phone, one of the men turned and fired a shot into the air, sending another wave of panic through the street. In the midst of the chaos, a black sedan screeched to a halt in front of the restaurant where Tessa had been. Greg's breath caught as he spotted her stepping out of the way, her face etched with fear as the robbers ran toward the car. Time seemed to slow as Greg watched, paralyzed. The men jumped into the car, and the driver hit the gas, speeding away. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Greg's phone buzzed again. It was a news alert about the robbery. His chest tightened as he realized how close Tessa had been to the danger. Meanwhile, Tessa stood frozen on the sidewalk, her heart racing. The robbery had unfolded so quickly, and she couldn't believe how close she'd come to being caught in the crossfire. She looked around, trying to steady her breathing. People were shouting, cars were honking, and the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. As the adrenaline wore off, Tessa realized she needed to get home. She flagged down a taxi, her hands still shaking as she climbed inside. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Crazy night, huh?" he said, trying to make light of the situation. "Yeah," Tessa replied softly, her mind still reeling. She couldn't shake the feeling that this night wasn't over yet. Back in his apartment, Greg paced the floor, unable to shake the image of Tessa standing in the chaos. He told himself it wasn't his problem, that she was just someone he'd talked to online. But deep down, he knew he'd made a mistake. And something told him he wasn't done with her story just yet. The taxi ride felt like a blur to Tessa. Her hands were still trembling, and her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She replayed the events of the night over and over: Greg's rejection, the chaos outside the restaurant, the sight of masked men sprinting into a car with guns in hand. Her driver glanced back at her again, concern evident in his eyes. "You all right, miss? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tessa forced a smile. "I'm fine, thank you." But she wasn't fine. She had narrowly escaped being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the sting of Greg's message lingered in her chest like a fresh wound. As the taxi pulled up to her apartment building, she paid the driver, offering a small thank you before stepping out. The night air felt heavy, and she hurried inside, eager to lock her door behind her and feel safe again. She flipped on the lights in her living room and sank into her couch. The silence of her apartment was both a relief and a reminder of how alone she felt. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and for a split second, she hoped it might be Greg apologizing. But when she looked, it was a notification from a news app. "Breaking: armed robbery in Midtown. Suspects at large." Tessa groaned, tossing her phone aside. She didn't want to think about it anymore. She got up and went to the kitchen, deciding a cup of tea might calm her nerves. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she caught her reflection in the window. She saw a woman who had been through too much in one evening. But beneath her tired expression, there was a glint of determination. She wasn't going to let this night define her. Greg's ignorance wasn't her problem. If he couldn't see her worth, that was on him. As Tessa sipped her tea, her thoughts shifted. The robbery had been so close. What if she had been caught in the crossfire? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She pulled her phone back into her hands and opened the news app. The article detailed the robbery. A group of armed men had hit a jewelry store downtown, escaping with over $500,000 worth of merchandise. Witnesses had reported seeing them flee in a black sedan, but no arrests had been made yet. Meanwhile, across town, Greg sat in his dimly lit apartment, nursing another glass of whiskey. The guilt he felt earlier had grown into something heavier, something he couldn't shake. He had replayed Tessa's response to his message countless times, her words cutting through him like a knife. "Thanks for showing your true colors before I wasted any more time on you." He couldn't deny it, her words stung because they were true. He had shown his true colors, and they weren't flattering. As much as he tried to justify his decision to himself, he couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind telling him he had been a coward. Greg's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on his door. He frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who would be visiting him at this hour? Setting his glass down, he walked cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. 2 men stood in the hallway, their faces partially obscured by baseball caps. Something about them felt off. Greg's gut told him not to open the door, but before he could step back, one of the men spoke, his voice loud enough to carry through the wood. "Hey, open up. We know you're in there. Just want to talk." Greg froze. His mind raced as he tried to figure out who they were and what they wanted. He wasn't the type to have enemies, at least, he thought he wasn't. But something about the way the man spoke sent a chill down his spine. "I'm not interested," Greg called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The man outside laughed, a cold, menacing sound. "Oh, you'll be interested. Open the door, or we'll open it for you." Greg's heart pounded in his chest. He backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the room. His phone was on the kitchen counter. He needed to call the police, but he didn't want to make a move that might provoke them. Before he could decide what to do, a loud crash echoed through the apartment as the door was kicked open. Greg stumbled back, his mind racing as the 2 men stormed in. One of them held a gun, his eyes scanning the room with predatory precision. "All right," the man with the gun said, pointing it at Greg. "We're gonna make this real simple. Sit down, shut up, and you won't get hurt." Greg raised his hands, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but you've got the wrong guy." The second man sneered, stepping closer. "Oh, we know exactly who you are. We saw you staring out the window earlier. You saw too much." It clicked in Greg's mind. These men were part of the robbery he'd seen earlier. They must have noticed him watching from his apartment. His stomach turned as he realized the danger he was in. "I didn't see anything," Greg lied, his voice shaking. "I swear, I didn't see anything." The man with the gun narrowed his eyes. "Don't play dumb with us. You want to make it out of here alive? Then shut your mouth and cooperate." Greg's mind raced. He needed to get out of this situation, but he didn't know how. He glanced toward the kitchen, where his phone sat on the counter, just out of reach. If he could distract them for even a moment, he might be able to call for help. As if sensing his thoughts, the second man followed Greg's gaze and smirked. "Don't even think about it," he said, pulling a knife from his pocket. "You so much as move, and you'll regret it." Greg swallowed hard, fear gripping him like a vice. He needed to think of something, anything, to get out of this alive. But before he could come up with a plan, the sound of footsteps in the hallway caught everyone's attention. The 2 intruders exchanged a glance, their expressions tense. The footsteps stopped just outside the apartment, and then a voice called out. "Police. Open up." The men froze, their faces pale. Greg's heart leaped with a mix of relief and dread. The situation had just become even more volatile, and he knew things could go south at any moment. The tension in the apartment was electric. Greg's heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he thought it might give him away. The 2 intruders exchanged frantic glances, their previous confidence now replaced with panic. "Police. Open the door, or we're coming in." The voice outside was firm, commanding. The man with the gun swung his weapon toward Greg. "You breathe a word, and you're dead," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. Greg swallowed hard, his hands trembling. He didn't dare move. His eyes flicked toward the shattered remnants of his front door, wondering if the police had heard the commotion. The man with the knife gestured toward the window. "We gotta move," he whispered sharply. "They'll be in here any second." The other man nodded, his gun still trained on Greg. "You're coming with us," he growled. "Insurance." Greg's stomach dropped. Wait, he stammered, trying to keep his voice calm. "You don't need me. I don't know anything, I didn't see anything. Just go, and I won't say a word." "Shut up," the gunman snapped. "You're coming, or we're leaving you in a body bag." Before Greg could protest further, the sound of splintering wood filled the apartment as the police burst through the door. The first officer into the room shouted, "Freeze! Hands where we can see them." Chaos erupted. The gunman spun toward the officers, raising his weapon. "Don't do it," one of the officers yelled, but the warning came too late. A deafening crack echoed through the room as the gunman fired, his bullet striking the wall just inches from one of the officers. The police responded instantly, their weapons blazing. The air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, and Greg dropped to the floor, covering his head as he tried to make himself as small as possible. The second intruder dove behind the couch, using it as cover while he hurled curses at his partner. "Get us out of here," the knife-wielding man shouted, his voice frantic. He threw a glance toward the window, but the sight of officers surrounding the building crushed any hope of escape. The gunman, undeterred, fired again, forcing the officers to retreat momentarily. "We're not going down for this," he screamed, his voice wild with desperation. Greg stayed on the floor, his heart pounding as bullets zipped past him. He could hear the officers shouting commands, their voices blending with the chaos. He knew he needed to get out of the line of fire, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay down and stay still. Suddenly, the man with the knife lunged toward Greg, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him upright. "You want to live?" he snarled. "Move." Greg stumbled to his feet, the knife pressing against his side. He could feel the cold metal through his shirt, and terror coursed through him. The man dragged him toward the door, using him as a human shield. "Back off, or he's dead," the knife-wielding man shouted, his voice cracking with fear and rage. The officers hesitated, their guns trained on the pair. "Let him go," one of them said, his tone measured. "You're surrounded. There's no way out." The gunman joined them, his weapon still smoking. "Stay back," he barked. "We'll kill him." Greg's mind raced. He could feel the blade digging into his ribs, the gunman's wild eyes darting between the officers. He knew he had to do something, but what? His hands were shaking, and his throat was dry, but he forced himself to speak. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice trembling. "It's over. Just put the weapons down, and no one else has to get hurt." "Shut up," the knife-wielding man snapped, shaking him roughly. "You think we're just gonna give up? You think we're stupid?" Greg didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing too fast, searching for an escape. He noticed the gunman's grip on his weapon had loosened slightly, his focus shifting between the officers and his partner. It wasn't much, but it was something. The officers, meanwhile, were edging closer, their movements slow and deliberate. "We can work this out," one of them said, his voice steady. "But you need to let him go. No one needs to die tonight." The man with the knife laughed bitterly. "You cops always say that, but we know how this ends. We ain't going back to prison." "Then you're giving us no choice," the officer replied. His tone was calm, but Greg could see the tension in his posture, the readiness to act. Suddenly, the gunman's finger twitched on the trigger, and Greg's instincts took over. He drove his elbow backward, catching the man with the knife in the stomach. The unexpected blow caused the man to stumble, his grip on Greg loosening just enough for him to break free. Greg dove to the floor as the officers opened fire. The gunman tried to return fire, but he was quickly overpowered. The man with the knife made a desperate lunge for Greg, but an officer tackled him to the ground, disarming him in seconds. The room fell silent except for the heavy breathing of everyone involved. Greg stayed on the floor, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The officers moved quickly, securing the intruders and checking the room for any additional threats. "Are you okay?" one of the officers asked, kneeling beside Greg. His voice was kind, but his eyes were sharp, scanning Greg for any injuries. Greg nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah. I think so." As the officers led the intruders away, Greg sat on the floor, his mind reeling. The events of the night had unfolded so quickly, so violently, that he could hardly believe it was over. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new thought took root in his mind. Tessa. He had treated her horribly, rejecting her for reasons he now saw as shallow and ignorant. And yet, as he sat there, shaken but alive, he couldn't stop thinking about her strength, her dignity. He realized he owed her more than an apology. He owed her the truth about himself, and the chance to prove he could change. But would she even give him that chance? Greg didn't know. All he knew was that he had to try. The aftermath of the standoff left Greg in a haze. He sat on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by shattered furniture, bullet holes, and the lingering smell of gunpowder. The officers who had saved his life were now bustling about, collecting evidence and ensuring the intruders were properly restrained. One officer approached Greg again, kneeling beside him. This time, she had a gentler demeanor, though her expression was still one of professional concern. "You're sure you're not hurt?" she asked, her tone softer now. Greg nodded slowly. "I'm fine, physically." His voice was distant, as if he was speaking from somewhere far away. He couldn't take his eyes off the chaos around him, the splintered door, the bloodied knife lying on the ground, the overturned table where the gunman had tried to make his last stand. "You're lucky," the officer continued. "These guys were dangerous. They've been hitting places all over the city. You're lucky we got here when we did." "Yeah," Greg muttered. "Lucky." But he didn't feel lucky. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before. And more than that, he felt ashamed. The realization of what had just happened, the fragile thread his life had hung on, brought his earlier actions into stark relief. He had judged Tessa based on something as superficial as her skin color, and yet, in the face of real danger, it hadn't mattered who was what. It had only mattered who was willing to act. Greg's thoughts spiraled as he watched the officers work. His phone, lying untouched on the counter, buzzed with a notification. He hesitated, then reached for it, his hand trembling slightly. It wasn't Tessa. It was a breaking news alert. Armed robbery suspects apprehended after dramatic police standoff. The article detailed the arrests, mentioning Greg's neighborhood and the role his apartment had played in the suspect's final stand. His stomach churned as he read. The news cycle would undoubtedly spin this into a spectacle, and he didn't know if he could handle being part of it. But as he scrolled through his phone, another notification caught his eye. This one was from a social media app, a message from Tessa. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, not after the way he'd treated her. His finger hovered over the notification for a moment before he opened it. The message was simple. "I hope you're okay. I saw the news." Greg's heart sank. Of course she'd seen it. The robbery had been big news, and the standoff was bound to draw attention. But her message wasn't accusatory or bitter. It was concerned. Genuine. For the first time that night, Greg felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he hadn't burned every bridge. Maybe he still had a chance to make things right. But he couldn't just send her a quick reply. He owed her more than that. If he was going to reach out, it had to be in person. It had to be honest. Meanwhile, Tessa sat in her own apartment, staring at her phone. She had debated whether or not to message Greg for hours. After what had happened earlier, she wasn't sure if she wanted anything to do with him. But then she'd seen the news, the robbery, the standoff, the reports of hostages. And she couldn't help but think about him. Greg had disappointed her deeply, but no one deserved to go through something like that. The thought of him being hurt, or worse, had stirred something in her, a lingering empathy she couldn't quite shake. So she'd sent the message, even though part of her had wanted to delete it and move on. Now, as she waited for a reply, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. What if he took her concern as an invitation? What if he didn't respond at all? She didn't know which outcome would be worse. Her phone buzzed, and she nearly dropped it in her haste to check the screen. But it wasn't Greg. It was her best friend, Simone, calling. Tessa. Oh my God, are you okay? Simone's voice was a mix of relief and panic. I'm fine, Tessa said, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. Why? Why? Have you seen the news? That robbery was like 2 blocks from your date tonight. And don't even get me started on that guy bailing on you. If I ever see him. Simone, Tessa interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. It's okay. I'm okay. There was a pause on the other end. Then Simone sighed. All right. But seriously, Tessa, you deserve better. That guy showed his true colors, and you don't need that kind of energy in your life. Tessa nodded, even though Simone couldn't see her. I know. I'm just trying to move past it. Well, don't rush it, Simone said. Take your time. And if you need to talk, you know where I am. Thanks, Simone. I appreciate it. After they hung up, Tessa felt a little steadier. Simone was right, she did deserve better. And maybe that meant letting go of Greg entirely. But as much as she tried to convince herself, part of her wasn't ready to close that door just yet. Back at his apartment, Greg stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, and his eyes bloodshot from the night's ordeal. He barely recognized himself. He thought about Tessa, about her message. About the way he'd treated her. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him, but he knew he had to try. Not for her, necessarily, but for himself. If he wanted to be better, he had to start somewhere. Greg grabbed his keys and headed for the door. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't let the night end without trying. Greg's drive to Tessa's apartment was quiet and tense. The usual sounds of the city, blaring horns and chatter on the sidewalks, felt muffled under the weight of his thoughts. The streetlights cast fleeting shadows across his face, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened with each passing block. He replayed the events of the evening over and over, each memory stinging sharper than the last. He parked a block away from her building, his nerves getting the best of him. Sitting in his car, Greg took a deep breath and glanced at his phone, hoping for some divine sign that he was doing the right thing. Tessa's message stared back at him, simple but powerful, asterisk, I hope you're okay. Asterisk. It wasn't much, but it gave him hope. He wasn't sure if she'd even let him inside, but he had to try. With one last deep breath, Greg stepped out of the car, feeling the cold night air bite at his skin. Inside her apartment, Tessa sat on the couch, staring at the television, though she wasn't really watching. The muted news broadcast showed footage from the robbery, complete with shaky cell phone videos from bystanders. She recognized Greg's building immediately, her stomach twisting at the sight. Why do I even care? She whispered to herself, shaking her head. After the way he'd treated her, she shouldn't feel anything for him. But she did. Maybe it was because she'd seen glimpses of a better version of him on their earlier conversations online, someone thoughtful, funny, and kind. A knock at her door startled her out of her thoughts. She froze, staring at the door as her heart raced. It was late, far too late for casual visitors. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice cautious. "It's Greg," came the reply, muffled but unmistakable. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. Of all the people she'd expected, Greg wasn't one of them. She hesitated, her mind racing. What was he doing here? "Please," Greg added after a moment of silence. "I just need a minute." Tessa walked to the door but stopped short of opening it. "Why?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "Because I owe you an apology," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Part of her wanted to send him away, to let him feel the sting of rejection. But the other part, the part that still believed in second chances, made her unlock the door and pull it open. Greg stood there, looking disheveled and drained. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. Tessa stepped aside, letting him in without a word. The tension in the room was palpable as Greg sat on the edge of her couch, his hands clasped tightly together. Tessa leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I don't even know where to start," Greg admitted, breaking the silence. "Start with the truth," Tessa said simply. Greg nodded, swallowing hard. "I messed up," he said. "I judged you before I even met you, and that was wrong. I thought I was better than that, but clearly, I wasn't. And when I saw you tonight, I panicked. Not because of you, but because of what I thought people might think of me." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly did you think they'd think?" "That I was stepping out of line," Greg admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. And I know how that sounds, how horrible it is, but I'm trying to be honest." Tessa shook her head, a mix of disbelief and disappointment on her face. "You're right. It does sound horrible." Greg winced but didn't look away. "I know. And I'm sorry. Not just for tonight, but for every ignorant thought I've ever had. You didn't deserve that. You're incredible, Tessa. And I blew it." Tessa's expression softened, though she didn't let her guard down completely. "You did," she said bluntly. "But at least you're admitting it." "I want to be better," Greg said, his voice filled with earnestness. "I don't want to be that person anymore. I know I've got a lot to learn, but I want to try. And I don't expect you to forgive me, or even give me another chance, but I needed to say this." Tessa studied him for a long moment, her emotions a whirlwind. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, but sincerity wasn't enough to erase the hurt he'd caused. Still, there was something in his vulnerability that resonated with her. "I can't just forget what happened," she said finally. "But I appreciate you owning up to it." Greg nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. "That's more than I deserve." "Probably," Tessa said with a faint smirk. Greg chuckled softly, the tension in the room easing slightly. "Thank you for letting me in," he said. "I mean it." "Don't thank me yet," Tessa said, her tone serious. "Actions speak louder than words, Greg. If you really want to change, prove it. Not just to me, but to yourself." "I will," Greg promised. Their conversation continued, the initial awkwardness giving way to something more genuine. Greg opened up about his experiences, his fears, and the events of the evening that had shaken him to his core. Tessa listened, sharing her own perspectives when she felt it was appropriate. By the time Greg left, the air between them felt lighter. There was no guarantee of a future between them, but there was a spark of understanding, a tentative beginning. As Greg walked back to his car, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, He felt like he was on the right path. Greg drove home with a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. The city seemed quieter than usual, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath after the night's chaos. His conversation with Tessa replayed in his mind, every word, every expression etched into his thoughts. He knew he had made progress, but he also knew the road ahead was long. When he pulled into his driveway, the reality of the evening's earlier events hit him again. His door was still shattered, police tape crisscrossed the entryway, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. The weight of the robbery, the violence, and his confrontation with Tessa pressed down on him all at once. Greg stepped over the splintered wood and into his apartment, careful not to disturb the evidence markers left by the police. He collapsed onto his couch, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his sister, Rachel. Heard about the robbery. You okay? Greg stared at the message for a moment before replying. Yeah. Just shaken up. Rachel's response came quickly. You need anything? I can come over. Greg hesitated. Rachel meant well, but she had a way of prying that he wasn't ready to deal with. No, I'm good. Just need some rest. Thanks. After a few more texts, Rachel relented, leaving Greg alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Greg woke to the sound of construction outside. Workers were already replacing doors and repairing damage to the building from the robbery. He shuffled to the kitchen, his muscles sore from the tension of the night before. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from Tessa. Good morning. I hope you're feeling better today. Greg smiled despite himself. He quickly typed back. Thanks. I'm still processing everything, but I'm okay. Hope you're doing well too. The response came almost immediately. I am. Take it one step at a time. Her words, simple yet supportive, filled him with a sense of hope. He wanted to show her that he could change, that he was serious about becoming a better person. But where to begin? Later that day, Greg found himself at a community center not far from his apartment. It was a place he had driven past countless times but never thought to enter. Today, though, he felt drawn to it. The sign outside advertised volunteer opportunities, and Greg figured it was as good a place to start as any. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Children ran through the halls, laughing and shouting, while adults worked at various stations. A receptionist greeted Greg with a warm smile. Hi there. Looking to get involved? She asked. Yeah, Greg said, a little uncertainly. I'm new to this, but I want to help. The receptionist nodded. That's great. We can always use more volunteers. Do you have any specific skills or interests? Greg thought for a moment. I'm pretty handy, he said. Good with tools, fixing things. Perfect, she said. We're renovating the youth rec room, and we could use some extra hands. Let me show you where to start. As Greg followed her down the hall, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. This wasn't about proving anything to Tessa or anyone else, it was about doing something meaningful. Meanwhile, Tessa was spending her afternoon with Simone, who had insisted on a coffee date to debrief the night before. They sat in a cozy cafe, sipping lattes and chatting about everything from work to relationships. So, Simone said, leaning in conspiratorially. Did he text you again? Tessa rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her small smile. Yes, he did. And? Simone prompted, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. And, he seemed sincere, Tessa admitted. He apologized, and he's trying to make things right. I don't know where it'll go, but I appreciate the effort. Simone raised an eyebrow. Effort is good, but don't let him off the hook too easily. People can talk a big game, but actions matter more. I know, Tessa said. That's why I'm not rushing into anything. He has to prove himself. Good, Simone said firmly. Because you deserve someone who sees your worth from the start, not after they mess up. Tessa nodded, feeling both reassured and conflicted. She wanted to believe Greg could change, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to fully trust him again. Over the next few weeks, Greg threw himself into volunteering. He spent hours at the community center, fixing walls, painting, and even building furniture for the youth rec room. The work was hard but fulfilling, and he found himself connecting with people he might never have interacted with before. One afternoon, as he was putting the finishing touches on a bookshelf, the director of the center approached him. "You've been a real asset to us, Greg," she said. "Thank you for all your hard work." Greg smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's been good for me. I needed this." "Well, the kids appreciate it," she said. "And so do we." Greg felt a swell of pride. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a positive difference. One evening, as Greg was leaving the center, he noticed a familiar figure waiting by his car. It was Tessa. She smiled when she saw him, her expression warm but cautious. "Hey," she said. "Hey," Greg replied, surprised but pleased to see her. "What brings you here?" "I heard you've been volunteering," Tessa said. "I wanted to see for myself." Greg chuckled nervously. "Guess I passed the test." Tessa smiled. "You're off to a good start." They stood there for a moment, the tension between them replaced by something lighter. "Do you have time for dinner?" Tessa asked. Greg blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah," he said quickly. Greg and Tessa walked into a small, cozy restaurant a few blocks from the community center. The warm glow of the hanging lights and the hum of quiet chatter set a comfortable tone. Greg held the door for Tessa, an unspoken gesture of his growing attentiveness, and she nodded with a small smile as they stepped inside. As they sat across from each other, Greg felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in weeks. This wasn't just a dinner, it was an opportunity. "Thanks for agreeing to this," he said as he picked up the menu. "I figured you earned it," Tessa replied, her tone even but with a trace of humor. "You've been putting in the work, and I respect that." Greg nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement. "It's been eye-opening, to say the least. I didn't realize how much I was missing out on, or how blind I was to my own flaws." "You could say biases," Tessa said, not unkindly. "Let's call them what they are." Greg winced but nodded. "Fair. My biases. I've been unpacking a lot of them lately, and honestly, it's been humbling. I don't think I'd have started this journey if it weren't for you." Tessa leaned back, studying him carefully. "That's a nice sentiment, Greg, but I hope you're doing this for yourself too. I'm not here to fix you. That's your job." "I know," Greg said earnestly. "And I am. You just gave me the push I needed to start." As the evening went on, their conversation deepened. Greg opened up about his upbringing, the small-town values that had shaped him, and the narrow perspectives he had carried into adulthood. Tessa listened, occasionally interjecting with her own experiences of navigating a world that often judged her before she even spoke. "I remember the first time I got followed around a store," Tessa said, her voice steady but her eyes distant. "I was 15. My mom told me it would happen, but I didn't believe her until it did. It's exhausting, living like that." Greg frowned, his heart sinking. "I can't imagine. And honestly, I probably wouldn't have thought about it at all if you hadn't told me." "That's the thing," Tessa said. "People shouldn't have to live through something for it to matter. Empathy doesn't require experience, it just requires listening." Greg nodded, her words sinking in. "I hear you. And I want to be better about that. About everything." After dinner, they stepped outside into the crisp night air. The city was alive around them, but the space between them felt intimate and quiet. "Walk you to your car?" Greg offered. Tessa hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure." As they strolled down the sidewalk, Greg felt a growing sense of hope. He didn't know where this would lead, but he was determined to keep moving forward. When they reached Tessa's car, she turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Greg," she said. "But this is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight." "I know," Greg said. "But I'm in it for the long haul. I promise." Tessa studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Good." As she got into her car and drove away, Greg stood there for a while, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. He wasn't the same person who had canceled that dinner date out of fear and prejudice. He was someone new, someone who was learning, growing, and trying to make amends. Weeks later, Greg found himself sitting in a diversity workshop hosted by the community center. It was a space for open dialogue, where people shared their experiences and discussed ways to create a more inclusive community. As he listened to the stories of others, Greg realized just how much work there was still to do, not just for himself, but for society as a whole. He spoke up during the discussion, sharing his own journey of unlearning and growth. Tessa was there too, sitting near the back of the room. She watched as Greg spoke, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and cautious optimism. She knew his journey was far from over, but she could see that he was committed. After the session ended, Greg approached her with a sheepish smile. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I wanted to see how you do," Tessa said, her tone teasing but kind. "And? You didn't embarrass yourself," she said with a grin. Greg laughed, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "I'll take that as a win." As they left the center together, the future felt uncertain but full of possibility. Greg knew he had a long road ahead, but for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. And that, he realized, made all the difference.